Missiles may rarely win wars on their own, but they can change who gets to start wars and who can sustain them. From long-range cruise missiles to hypersonic glide vehicles, the technology is advancing fast. To get a closer look at the next generation of missiles, what's being used on today's battlefields, and what's coming down the line, I am joined by Matthew Bunn, James R. Schlesinger Professor of the Practice of Energy, National Security, and Foreign Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you again for staying with us. Now, the 2022 Missile Defense Review highlights the growing role of missiles in modern warfare, as we've seen in Ukraine and the recent India-Pakistan or Iran-Israel conflicts. How have these systems shifted the balance of power in recent wars?
So I think that they have made a big difference in making life miserable and inflicting terror, for example, in both Israel and Ukraine. But in terms of actually destroying major strategic targets, missiles have not done a fantastic job. It's remarkable how resilient Ukraine has been in the face of ferocious Russian attacks involving hundreds and hundreds of missiles and drones. Zelensky remains alive. All of the top leadership, both political and military, of Ukraine remains alive. There's still electricity in Ukraine. There's still internet in Ukraine. Ukraine's military forces, they have suffered damage from missiles. There's no doubt about it, but they're continuing to fight hard and sometimes successfully on the battlefield. Now, partly, Ukraine has a civilian system that's almost uniquely resilient, built in Soviet times. Their electricity system in particular was sort of designed to survive war because that was something the Soviet Union worried about. But they've made some interesting additions that Taiwan might think about. For example, one of the things that is quite vulnerable in most countries are electrical substations that take the really high voltage power and step it down to lower voltages that can then be distributed to households. Those substations, their equipment is very hard to manufacture, and there are only a few companies that make it, and so it's hard to replace. So the Russians started attacking it in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians built shelters over the substations so that one or two conventionally armed missiles isn't enough to take out the substation. I think that's probably a good idea for a lot of countries. So I think we shouldn't exaggerate how much missiles are changing the balance of power, but I do think for a maritime battle like one over the defense of Taiwan, a lot of ships are going to be vulnerable, especially to missiles that can maneuver like hypersonic missiles. And the combination of that and both airborne and undersea drones and underwater mines is a complex military problem for major ships to try to survive.
Now, the growing availability of missiles coupled with hybrid warfare tactics heightens the risk of miscalculations and possibly lead to escalation. So what are your concerns, particularly when we talk about nuclear warheads on missiles?
So nuclear dangers are sort of my main professional concern in life. A nuclear war, if it happened, would not come out of a clear blue sky. It would arise out of some intense crisis or conflict between nuclear armed powers, such as the clash that we saw recently between India and Pakistan. And so thinking through how are those kinds of battles fought, how could a situation arise that led one side to think it was in its interest to use nuclear weapons, you're never going to have a situation where somebody wakes up one morning and says, boy, this would be a great day for a nuclear war. But you can imagine a situation where someone thinks their nuclear forces are already under attack, perhaps mistakenly, or someone thinks they can use a few nuclear weapons to accomplish some military or political objective and then hold the rest in reserve to deter the other side from striking back. These are the kinds of scenarios that could lead to disaster. I'm working with colleagues on a book at the moment looking again at past nuclear crises and false alarms and asking what factors made these events more dangerous, what factors made them less dangerous, how have those factors changed since then, and how can we strengthen those safety factors and weaken those danger factors in policy today. I think there's a lot to be done to reduce dangers. Now, the particular thing you were asking about in terms of missile escalation, one of the key issues is China, Russia, some other countries have missiles that can carry either nuclear or conventional weapons. So in a conventional conflict where you were being attacked by missiles of that type, it would be natural to go after all of the missiles of that type and try to destroy them. But that might lead the country whose missiles are being attacked to think, gee, they're trying to destroy my deterrent. I need to use them before I lose them. So in general, I think countries in such a conflict need to think through every move they make in terms of what do I think the adversary will perceive from that? What do I think they'll do in response? Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, made a very important statement. He said, you always need to leave the adversary a choice between humiliating defeat and nuclear war. You can't back them into a corner where there's no other choice.
The United States has finalized a deal to sell Taiwan National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, or NASAMS. How effective do you think these will be in terms of countering the PLA's missile and drone systems in a potential conflict?
China is making a very broad-based investment in its military forces, both conventional and nuclear. It's engaged in an unprecedented nuclear buildup, but also has really changed the balance in the Taiwan Strait, where the United States used to have overwhelming superiority, and that's just not true anymore. I think some of the most important steps to reduce the dangers are political. I think Taiwan needs to be careful not to take steps that China perceives as unacceptably moving toward total independence. I think that the United States and China need to work on finding an acceptable way of living and competing peacefully, just as the United States did with the Soviet Union back in the 1970s. I am hopeful that there will be some kind of summit between Trump and Xi either later this year or early next year, and I'm hopeful it will be more productive than Trump's summit with Putin in Alaska was. I think there's an opportunity to establish some rules of the road and even maybe some initial steps toward nuclear restraint. We have a real danger coming up on the horizon on the nuclear front, in that the last nuclear agreement limiting the U.S. nuclear forces and Russian nuclear forces expires in February, and there are absolutely no talks underway to replace it. And right now, there's no limits on China's nuclear forces. And we've never really tried to do numerical arms limitations with multiple parties in the nuclear space. Way back when, in the Washington Naval Treaty in the 1920s, there was an interesting multipolar naval arms control agreement. But there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done about how do we avoid a dangerous nuclear arms competition between the United States and Russia and the United States and China when this last agreement expires in February.
And Taiwan is currently developing its own indigenous missile systems, and they are understandably keeping it under the radar and not giving much detail about it. But what can Taiwan learn from Ukraine's experience as it tries to step up the sophistication of its weaponry?
Taiwan needs a serious investment in integrated air and missile defense, and I think a serious investment in all of the different kinds of tools that would help it interfere with and make more costly any effort to come across the strait, or for that matter, any effort to blockade Taiwan, which may be a more realistic scenario. I think Taiwan and the United States can work together on that. But ultimately, I think Taiwan's defense depends primarily on Taiwan. And so I think some serious investments are needed, and not just in weapons that maybe can reach deep into China or something like that, but weapons that can really make it costly for China to do the particular things that would be the biggest threat to Taiwan.
What do you know about indigenous systems, and is it heading in the right direction, if there is such a thing?
So I have certainly not done an in-depth assessment of Taiwan's indigenous missile program. I would look at Ukraine. They are now building cruise missiles of their own because the supplies of such missiles from the West have been more limited than Ukraine would prefer. But I think perhaps more importantly is the gigantic production of drones that they have proved capable of. They are producing something of the order of 2 million drones a year now. And I think that's the kind of production capacity that Taiwan should consider building up.
Okay, and throwing forward, what emerging technologies do you have your eye on that you think, particularly when it comes to missile systems, or in changing how warfare will take shape over the next few decades as we're seeing more and more conflicts?
Well, I think we'll see, unfortunately, from my point of view, more and more automated systems. I think we are going to be, unfortunately, living in a world of what is sometimes called killer robots. That is, drones that can search for targets and destroy them on their own once they're unleashed. I do think that some of the electronic means of warfare have proved to be quite important. Electronic warfare, just to interfere with communications, for example, to drones, has been quite important in Ukraine. But I think also cyber will continue to be important. China has made a huge investment in cyber. Taiwan has been especially effective in countering that sort of thing, and also Taiwan has really sort of led the way on how to deal with foreign political interference using social media and things like that in Taiwanese elections. I think that whole realm, especially cyber attacks, I think is troubling to me, because with normal weapons, you sort of know when a soldier goes across a border, when a shell flies across a border. With cyber systems, adversaries are in each other's computers all day long, every day. And so it blurs the lines between peace and crisis, between crisis and conflict. And we don't really have agreed thresholds for what's an escalation in the cyber domain in the same way we sort of have in some of the other domains. And so I think the potential for cyber contributing to more physical conflicts escalating is very real.
Thank you very much. We've just about run out of time here, but it's been great to get your insight and really appreciate you staying up for us. Thank you, Professor Matthew Bunn, for joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts.